Hi, thanks for joining today. You are joining us on the Take Five project with Crystal and Abby for our All God's Children project. And today we're going to be talking for about the next 5 minutes or so about grief and loss. No doubt many of you have experienced grief and loss during the pandemic. And so we want to talk about what grief is, what loss is, some of the suffering that maybe you've encountered, and really give you some helpful tips to help you during this time. So first off, what is grief? Grief is the natural response to loss. It is a lifelong human experience beginning at birth and repeated continually throughout life as we experience the necessity of attachment and inevitability of loss. That's the definition by Mitchell and Anderson. There's different aspects of grief. One, grief, which refers to the process of experiencing the psychological, behavioral, social, and physical reactions to the perception of loss. Mourning refers to the conscious and unconscious processes and courses of action that promotes restoration to healthy functioning following a loss. And bereavement, which refers to the state of having suffered a loss. This last year has been challenging, and no doubt you have experienced grief. You've experienced loss. Maybe you might even say you've experienced suffering. What is suffering? Well, here's a couple definitions that I came up with, some from my own personal experience. Suffering is what happens when humans have a loss and feel distress about the loss. It is the pain of not having life go the way that we planned. It may be sitting with a dying person, a loved one. It is death and the finality of our loved ones not being with us. While suffering may be a part of the human condition, and we may all be a part of suffering in some way or another, it can raise a lot of questions for us. It can make us think differently. It can cause a grief reaction. There's different losses that we experience, maybe material loss. Maybe if we lost a home or something of value. Maybe we've had a relational loss, a death or a divorce, an intrapsychic loss, the loss of a dream. Maybe you set out to be and do something, and that wasn't fulfilled in the way that you thought. A functional loss. Maybe you've experienced a disability or a chronic illness. You've been diagnosed with a disease or an illness that changes the way that you function in life. Maybe you've had a role loss. Maybe your children have grown up, they've gone to college, or maybe they have gone out and started jobs and you're not caring for them in the same way. Maybe you're not the breadwinner the way that you once were. Or maybe a systemic loss. Maybe a system doesn't function in the same way that it once did. We have certainly experienced a lot of system changes this last year and different types of functioning as we have tried to adapt to COVID-19. There are common grief reactions. Lindemann talks about different symptoms of normal grief. We could have shock, some somatic distress. We could have preoccupation with images. And this is mostly talking about grief related to someone who has died or deceased, but we could have preoccupation with other images of grief and loss. Different losses can come up in our minds and we can see them in our dreams maybe, or we could be sitting down and our mind might wander to that. We could experience guilt. You've probably heard people say, if only I had been there, if only I had called the doctor, if only I had called the emergency people to come and help, if only, knowing that in reality, there's nothing we could have done about an unexpected encounter or event. Grief can also cause anger, hostility towards others, where we might ask questions of why. We may project some of those feelings of anger onto other people or onto systems, onto structures, and we may say things like, these people don't care about me. They don't care about my well-being. That could be a reaction to the grief that we're experiencing from a loss. Our feelings can tell us things about ourselves. We could also have altered patterns of conduct, maybe showing up late for work or not coming into work, maybe not taking any vacation or PTO, and overworking possibly could be patterns, different patterns of conduct. Therese Rando also talks about complicated grief. She says, when grief does not begin, or it stops, or is diverted or distorted, the transformative potential inherent in grief is blocked. There could be different types of complicated grief with history of alcohol or substance abuse, maybe someone who might identify as a perfectionist, perfectionist tendencies in their personality, someone who may struggle with depression or anxiety or have a pre-existing mental illness or mental disorder. Maybe we've experienced physical or emotional harm or abuse in our past, and we could have some complicated grief from that. Maybe an early childhood loss, maybe someone in your family passed away, or a childhood friend passed away, or something that maybe felt unresolved. There could be emotional dependency and or over-identification that can happen. Maybe you've experienced multiple losses in a short time, especially over this last year with COVID-19. We've had many losses, many people in our lives and in our support systems who have died or who have been impacted by this illness. We might feel like we have lack of social support. We can also have complicated grief from a sudden death or a death after a very long chronic illness. We could also experience complicated grief when we've been impacted by a traumatic death, such as suicide. Even our own poor health, or maybe some issues going on with us can cause some complicated grief. We could have socially negated losses, and sometimes complicated grief more persistently focused on ourselves. There can be a time where the grief feels so overwhelming that all we can think about is ourselves. It's during those times that we really need to ask for help and look at some of our resources. There are, Lindemann also talks about morbid grief reactions, where we could have overactivity without a sense of loss. We could have extreme hostility toward others, hidden hostility. We could have increased isolation from others over time, maybe not going to family gatherings or not going to community meetings. We could have risky behaviors like smoking or drinking or using substances to kind of dull the pain. We could have a lack of self-care, maybe in our appearance or our hygiene. And we can also experience things like survivor guilt. It should have been me. Maybe you've had a loved one who has passed away from COVID-19, or a friend or a family member, and you thought, why did that happen to them? Maybe it should have been me. And so these are all kind of common, kind of more morbid grief reactions that can happen during times of trauma and loss and grief. We talked a little bit earlier about mourning, and this author here, which is W.M. Warden, speaks about the 4 tasks of mourning. And says the first task is to accept the reality of the loss. When we are experiencing grief and loss and something terrible has happened, we first need to accept the reality of that loss and process through that shock. The second thing is to work through the pain and the grief. Not to avoid it, but to work through it. The third is to adjust to the environment without the deceased or without the loss. The fourth one is to emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life. And these tasks are not linear. This is not something that I could say you might do in 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 7 months. This takes time, and it takes, it can look differently for people. But we may experience some barriers in grieving and mourning and loss. Some of those could be, we might avoid the feelings of pain. We may even have some physical pain that could accompany our grief. Maybe you might experience headaches, or you might experience physical sensations related to your grief. Maybe not wanting to eat, or maybe overeating. Another barrier is that society can really stigmatize mourning. You know, when you've had a loss in your life or something that has happened, sometimes people don't know how to listen. They don't know how to talk to you about that grief. They don't know how to listen and hear the feelings that you're experiencing with that loss. That can be very, very challenging in helping, in trying to move through that grief and that mourning process. There could even be times where you could feel some extreme sadness, or maybe even possible depression from avoiding the pain of grief. And sometimes these can be conscious or unconscious processes where we may just want to kind of compartmentalize or set that grief aside. And really that's not reality. When we come to work, when we come to this setting, all of who we are comes with us. And both the joys in our life and the pain and the grief comes with us. And we really have the ability to choose in some ways how we process that grief if we know more about that, and if we're willing to look into our grief and try to feel better. So what are some helpful and practical tools that you can use for dealing with grief? First, recognize that you are not alone. You are not alone in your grief. Suffering and grief is part of the human condition. And many people, many of your colleagues have been through grief and suffering and loss. So recognize you are not alone. Second, find a friend or a colleague to talk with. You might just be surprised how helpful that can be, to share what you're going through, to share how you're feeling, and to really talk that out with a friend. Maybe find a creative outlet for your grief. Write in a journal, do some painting, do some poetry, sing a song, listen to some music, do some body exercises that involve dance or exercise. Maybe connect and or reconnect to spiritual resources. Find a community to get involved with. Stay connected to your family and use virtual technology, maybe when physical presence is not possible. And recognize your limits during grief. Create some space and care for yourself that involves rest and relaxation. When you have days off, use those days to find some rest and relaxation if possible. Make time to go on vacation and take your PTO. Try not to build your PTO up for the whole year, but take your PTO. And this is a huge one, and I'm not great at this, I'll tell you that, but I'm learning more about it. Ask for help. Reach out to the resources that are available to you, such as EAP counselors, HR, spiritual and pastoral care services, and speak with your manager or your director. And always know chaplains are available. We'd love to listen to you. We would love to create this space for you to talk about your grief and your loss, and to be with you in this journey. You are not alone. I keep saying that because sometimes that's a huge barrier in processing grief. People feel like they're alone, but you're not alone in this. We're here with you. We want to help you. We want to help provide some resources for you today. These are some of the resources that I used in this PowerPoint. And so these are available to you, and we will be posting this PowerPoint and have this available for you to look at. So thanks for joining today on our Take 5 episode. It's been great to be with you. I know this is a heavy topic to talk a little bit about grief and loss, but the more that you can be aware of your grief and loss, the more choice you have to help yourself during this time, and to reach out and use some of these resources and helpful and practical tips that will help you during this time. Thanks. We'll see you later. Bye.